Okay, we are right at the top of the hour, so I'm going to take care of a few housekeeping items so we can get started. First, I would like to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today as we ask the auditor some more questions about the PCI framework, specifically over requirements 5 and 6. If at any point during the presentation you have any questions, we would encourage you to use the Q&A feature to ask those questions, and we will be reserving some time at the end of the presentation today to address any of those. Just to give you a little bit of background about who we are at Kirkpatrick Price, we are a PCI qualified security assessor and licensed CTA firm providing assurance services to over 400 clients in more than 46 states, Canada, Asia, and Europe. The firm has over 10 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. Moderating for us today will be Brian Callan. Brian is an information security specialist here at Kirkpatrick Price, and he focuses on aiding clients in understanding the differences between the audit frameworks and deciding which framework will best suit our clients' needs. So Brian, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to hand it over to you.
Good deal. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for taking some time today to learn about the PCI Data Security Standard. And just to give you a little background about Kirkpatrick Price, we are a third-party assessor that specializes in regulatory compliance and information security. We will audit and assess companies that are governed by the CFPB, and we also provide audit sources or services to help you comply with the PCI, SSA 16, SOC 2, FISMA, and ISO standards, as well as similar standards and regulations. And I'd like to introduce today the PCI expert we'll be talking with, Steve McEnroe. Steve is an Information Security Auditor at Kirkpatrick Price and assists clients in PCI Readiness and Audit. Steve also holds certifications of Qualified Security Assessor and Certified Information Systems Security Auditor. And we are very pleased to have him here today to give us some insight and ideas about some of these requirements for PCI Data Security Standard. And when we talk about the PCI Data Security Standard, basically it is a data security standard that is jointly developed by the payment card brands such as Visa, MasterCard, American Express, and Discover. And they have jointly put this standard together for the purposes of enhancing security across the industry. Now, version 3.0 of the PCI Data Security Standard became effective on January 1st of this year, and since then there's already been a new release published, and this is primarily because there are so many new vulnerabilities that are constantly being discovered and must be addressed. Now, the PCI Data Security Standard applies to any merchant who stores, processes, or transfers cardholder data, any service provider who stores, processes, or transmits cardholder data on behalf of a merchant, and any subservice provider of a merchant or service provider who has active access to the cardholder data environment. So whether you are a one-employee company that stores, transports, or processes credit card information, or a 10,000-employee company that does the same, the PCI Data Security Standard applies to you. Now, the standard is broken into 12 subject areas, and our webinar series has been focusing on the areas one at a time. There are 6 control objectives for these 12 subject areas, and in those control objectives you have about 212 controls. So there's a lot to look at, and that's why we have broken them out to dive a little deeper into these areas and answer any questions you may have. Now, here we have a chart that shows the 6 control objectives and the corresponding requirements that go along with that. And you'll notice that we have already covered requirements 1 through 4, and today we're going to investigate requirements 5 and 6, which are under the objective of maintaining a vulnerability management program. Now, whether you're a merchant or a service provider, there are a couple different ways that you can test to being PCI compliant. You can complete a self-assessment questionnaire if you're eligible to use that method based on your volume requirements, or you can also have a third-party QSA such as Kirkpatrick Price come and perform an assessment that results in a PCI report on compliance. And this is a contractually driven requirement, and when you are in a relationship with an issuer or a merchant and you have to access to cardholder data environment, you have to contractually bound to comply with the PCI Data Security Standard. The lone exception is the state of Nevada, which has passed a state statute that requires businesses in that state to comply with the PCI data security standard if they store, transport, or process credit card information. One of the things we are concentrating on in each webinar is the importance of scope and understanding the scope of your cardholder data environment and which people, processes, systems are involved with storing, transporting, or processing credit card data. And it's important to know that errors in determining your scope can lead to serious consequences. Now, Steve, what are some of the serious consequences you have seen or heard about regarding inaccurate PCI scoping?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on today, Brian. And yeah, so some of the serious consequences can lead directly to a data breach. And you know, if the breach is serious enough, it can lead to compromise of cardholder data. So I just wanted to emphasize that it's important when you're engaging with even if you're doing your own assessment, but also if you're engaging with a QSA, you want to be as forthcoming as possible as to helping the QSA to identify all systems and networks that may connect to the cardholder data environment. The QSA is going to do his own due diligence through a number of different testing methods to make sure that the scope of the cardholder data environment is accurate. But again, that's not necessarily a fail-proof method just by having a QSA look at things. So again, I encourage people going through this process to, again, be as forthcoming as possible because, you know, leaving a system out or forgetting about a connected network or even a single system can lead to a weakness that could allow a malicious intruder to gain a foothold inside your network and again lead to a data breach.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And as we've mentioned in the past, the cardholder data environment includes all people, processes, and technologies that store, process, or transmit cardholder data, and all system components connected to those people, processes, and systems. Now, this is information we've reviewed in the past webinars, but it's definitely worth mentioning again. And Steve, what does no access mean for PCI purposes?
Well, no access means just that. It means that there is no way to connect to that network that's not approved and has not been vetted as a secure connection. So, in other words, you know, one of the typical situations we run into is a company will carve out a cardholder data environment and they'll restrict the access to that environment, but they'll still have you know, system administrators who have connectivity to it, maybe through specific open connections through the firewall. And in those cases, that's a connected to system component. So that administrator's workstation is then automatically considered to be in scope. Most organizations we work with are striving to keep even system administrator systems from having access to these environments. So a lot of times what we work with customers to do is install what we call a jump box or a jump server within the secure environment that the system administrators can then securely access via SSH or remote desktop session or something of that nature that allows them to securely manage that environment without their workstations being considered in scope. And then, you know, in this web-connected world, a lot of the end users, the company's end users, will use a web interface to, you know, work with the applications that are inside of the cardholder data environment. And, you know, by doing that, their systems are not directly connected because they're going out through the internet and using an HTTP or an HTTPS connection to then work with a web application that is maybe functioning inside that environment.
Okay, thanks. So what Steve and I are going to be concentrating on today is the PCI Data Security Standard Control Objective number 3, and that's maintaining a vulnerability management program, and that includes the 2 requirements: protecting all systems against malware and regularly updating antivirus software or programs, as well as developing and maintaining secure systems and applications. So we'll start with the requirement number 5, and more specifically requirement 5.1, which requires companies to deploy antivirus software on all systems commonly affected by malicious software. Now, Steve, do you recommend having the periodic evaluations to identify and evaluate evolving malware threats as they recommend here, performed by a third party, or should they be done internally?
This is something that's typically done internally, Brian. It's really part of your ongoing risk assessment process. You want to, be aware of industry developments. A lot of this information is distributed through various vendor websites, even through the mainstream media, and as well as through ongoing scanning and penetration testing, which is actually another part of the PCI DSS. It's requirement 11, but it comes into play here as far as being able to keep kind of keep up with evolving threats with malware and other types of risks that your business may face.
Okay, great. Well, next is requirement 5.2, which requires companies to ensure that all antivirus mechanisms are maintained. Now, Steve, at a minimum, how often would you recommend the periodic scans mentioned here be performed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see different situations with this. Most folks will scan, we'll do a full scan of a server once a week during off-business hours. And then they'll do more frequent scanning of any workstations that are in scope, typically on a nightly basis. And then a lot of the antivirus and malware systems now have, what we call live scanning or ongoing scanning or real-time scanning, where the workstation is constantly being evaluated based on the, network traffic that's taking place on the device. But just to reiterate, typically we see weekly scans on servers and then nightly scans on workstations.
Okay. Now, next is requirement 5.3.
And,
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing. There was a, yes, why would you do that? Workstations are typically inherently a very weak point because people are using these workstations. People are, typically the weakest link in the security stack because they easily fall for phishing attempts and social engineering attacks. And so those types of attacks are going to begin at the workstation level. So that's why you would have more periodic scans at the workstation.
Okay, great. Good info. Next is requirement 5.3, which requires companies to ensure that antivirus mechanisms are actively running and cannot be disabled or altered by users unless specifically authorized by management on a case-by-case basis for a limited time period. Now, Steve, can you give me some examples where it may be okay to temporarily disable your antivirus solution, as I mentioned here?
Occasionally, it might be necessary to disable the antivirus software if you need to install a particular software package. This is where I typically see that type of activity. But again, that should be a very temporary situation. This usually will occur on a workstation, maybe a developer workstation or something of that nature, which a developer workstation typically would not be within the CDE anyway. But again, you want to do that only temporarily and then re-engage the antivirus software once you're done performing whatever task is necessary. And also keep in mind that permanently disabling the antivirus on an in-scope system is going to be a violation of the PCI DSS. So if you were to have a situation where you technically are not able to run antivirus on a Windows platform primarily, you're going to need to work with your QSA to possibly come up with some compensating controls that would help meet the rigor and intent of the original requirement to have that antivirus solution in place, or possibly look at another technical solution to meet whatever business need you have, because it would definitely be a violation of the DSS.
Okay. Now, next is requirement 5.4, which requires companies to ensure that security policies and operational procedures for protecting systems against malware are documented, in use, and known to all affected parties. Steve, what are your thoughts on how often these security policies and operational procedures for protecting systems against malware should be updated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of your policies and procedures should be reviewed and updated at least annually. And you'll want to make sure that all of your documentation is maintaining a revision history so that the auditor can see the different phases that the document has gone through. Again, you want to do this at least on a yearly basis, and then anytime there's any significant change to the environment, whether it's technical or business level, say for example you change your antivirus vendor, you go from Symantec to Trend Micro or whatever the case may be, you're going to want to make sure that you update your documented procedures for how to manage and maintain that software to address the new package. Or also if there's some changes in, say a change to the PCI DSS, a midstream change to PCI DSS, you would want to make sure that your documentation is reviewed and updated accordingly to align with the data security standard.
All right. And now we move to requirement 6, and more specifically requirement 6.1, which requires companies to establish a process to identify security vulnerabilities using reputable outside sources for security vulnerability information and assigning a risk ranking to newly discovered security vulnerabilities. Steve, what are your thoughts on how often you should check to identify security vulnerabilities?
Well, that's really an ongoing process, but you want to, be subscribed to, information that's coming out from your vendors, for example, Microsoft or any big software packages that you have. Another good way to track security vulnerabilities that may be coming out is third-party websites like securitytracker.com, and even the mainstream media nowadays will will bubble this information up to the headlines, and you'll actually see it on again on the mainstream media, on the TV news or on the big websites. So there's a lot of different vectors that you can use to check for and identify security vulnerabilities. So your security personnel always want to have an eye out or an eye and an ear out for that type of information, and then to again relate it to your environment. How does this possibly affect us? And then do the necessary investigations so that you can take the necessary steps to make sure that your environment remains patched and secure.
All right. Well, next is requirement 6.2, which requires companies to ensure that all system components and software are protected from known vulnerabilities by installing applicable vendor-supplied security patches and install critical security patches within 1 month of release. Steve, how do you go about finding out what security patches you need?
Yeah, a lot of the vendors have really made this a lot easier now, as well as there's a lot of great software out there for managing vendor patches. For example, most folks will configure their workstations to automatically install critical Microsoft patches on the workstation level. On servers, you'll let those download, but you never let those go into production unattended, because they sometimes cause resets and can cause other issues. But your vendors are going to be one of the first levels of notification, as well as vulnerability scans are going to help you to keep abreast of security patches that you may need for things that may get missed by the big vendor patches, right? So other things that you may have running on services or software you may have running on your systems that could become vulnerable due to a flaw that's been identified. So those are really your two best vectors for finding out about what kind of patches you may need on your systems.
Okay. Next is requirement 6.3, which requires companies to develop internal and external software applications, including web-based administrative access to applications, securely. Now, Steve, are there any guidelines on how to incorporate information security into your software development? Yeah,
there are. There's some good white papers out there actually on this topic. SANS.org has some good reading material on this. If you were to just Google SANS and then just put information security and software development, you'll get some really good information there. But at the higher level, you want to think security from the very beginning whenever you're developing an application or even making major changes to one. A lot of companies are, they're moving fast. They may have limited staff and limited time and budget to implement software applications. And, the first thing that typically gets left off the table is security. So the main thing to do is to keep this in mind from the very beginning, because it's difficult to bolt security onto the side. It's really better if it's baked in from the beginning. And if you have in mind, okay, we're interacting with cardholder data. What are the requirements around protecting that information? And then you can look into the standards and the requirements, and then make the proper planning decisions from a technology standpoint to make sure that you're following those guidelines and protecting the data appropriately. So that's really, the key is to think about it from the beginning at the project planning level, and then keep that in place as you move on down through the actual coding, implementation, and maintenance of the software.
All righty. Now we see requirement 6.3.1, which requires companies to remove development, test, and/or custom application accounts, user IDs, and passwords before applications become active or are released to customers. So, Steve, do you have any comments about this requirement?
Yeah, in general, developers will a lot of times will put elements into the code, whether it's backdoor accounts or hard-coded information into the code, or even elements in the database that make it easy to test while they're working on the application itself. And it's important to make sure that you clean that information out. Don't leave it just commented out in your code. You want to make sure that stuff is removed completely, because if someone is able to somehow get a hold of the code or to look at comments in your HTML, that could give them breadcrumbs that lead them further into possibly compromising a system. So you want to make sure that whenever you're doing a build on your production environment, that it's a completely clean build with none of that type of information embedded in it, either in the database or in the code.
All righty. Next we have requirement 6.3.2, which requires companies to review custom code prior to release to production or customers in order to identify any potential coding vulnerability. Now, Steve, would you recommend an automated or manual process when it comes to code review?
I personally like to see a hybrid of the two. I know that code review applications can be a bit pricey out there. There's some other what's the word I'm looking for? Open source types solutions as well that can be useful. But then to actually have a peer take a look at your code at the same time is definitely very valuable, especially when a company has regimented practices in place for what's the proper way to handle errors, what's the proper way to comment your code, what's the proper way to handle different coding techniques. If you want to make sure that your developers are staying aligned with your best practices that you've developed in your software development lifecycle, then that set of human eyes is very valuable when it comes to that.
Okay.
And so as a side note to that, before we leave this topic, it's very important, especially when you're doing a PCI assessment. Your QSA is going to want to see documentation that this is actually taking place. Typically, we're looking for something a little bit more than just a note in a ticketing system. We're looking for some sort of a checklist. Obviously, if you're using an automated tool, you're going to be able to generate some sort of a report for that, and then be able to tie those artifacts back to your change management system. So the particular work ticket that you had for that particular software project or that change, you want to be able to tie those artifacts back to those tickets in the system so that the QSA can tie that all together when he's doing his review.
All righty. Well, next is requirement 6.4, which requires companies to follow change control processes and procedures for all changes to system components. Now, Steve, why is it important to separate development or test environments from production environments, as they say here?
The test and development environments can be less secure in some cases. Again, sometimes you're working with hard-coded elements in the software or information in the database itself that could be a weakness, and you definitely don't want that type of information tied to the production environment. Typically, you do not want developers to have access to the production environment directly. You'll want a system administrator for the cardholder data environment to be the one who actually does the deployments to the production environment. And in cases, and this is usually a struggle in smaller shops, right, where the developer is typically doing the deployments to production. In those cases, you're going to make sure you got the proper level of oversight on that developer, the proper logging, even separate user credentials, different unique username and unique passwords into those systems. And again, I've seen situations where the system administrator may not have the necessary tools or skills to do the deployments. He'll be the one who actually logs into the system and then allows the developer to do the work. Therefore, the developer never actually has direct logical access to the production environment. Only through the administrator does he have that access. So again, it's just important to keep those two environments separated because of the different security levels that those two environments could have.
Okay. And next, requirement 6.4.5 addresses change control procedures for the implementation of security patches and software modifications and what they must include. So, Steve, do you have any comments about this requirement?
Yeah, it is very important to make sure that all of your changes to the production environment are documented. It gives you a way of following up on any changes that take place, and that way it limits the kinds of surprises that you may have in production if people are able to just go in and make changes to production without any management approval, without any way to back out the change. As far as change control goes, I see, this is documented in various ways. There's a lot of good software out there for tracking this type of thing, but some leaner, meaner shops, still do it sort of an old-fashioned way by filling out a Word document or something and keeping it on file, or even through the use of an email chain as well. But whatever method you choose to do it through, it's very important that you take into consideration these particular elements that we're looking at on the screen and make sure that they're clearly documented and that this is done on a consistent basis. If the QSA is looking into change records that have taken place on the system in comparison to change control tickets, you want those two to line up during a PCI assessment.
Okay. And next is requirement 6.5, which requires companies to address common coding vulnerabilities in software development processes, which involves training developers in secure coding techniques and developing applications based on secure coding guidelines. Steve, how do you recommend training developers in secure coding techniques, as they say here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of good third-party information available on this. There's a lot of good computer-based training available nowadays. If anyone needs some recommendations or links to some of the training sites, just feel free to get in touch with us, and we can provide you with some of that. The OWASP is a very good, OWASP.org is a very good place to go for web-based best coding practices, and they provide a lot of good content on how to code in defense of a lot of the web-based vulnerabilities that are out there. So some companies will do some of their own internal training based on say the OWASP material. You can approach it in that format as well. So, but the main thing is to have process for this in place and be able to document it and demonstrate the use of this training to to your QSA. One thing that I've seen companies do over time is they'll subscribe to a secure coding third-party training company or something, and then they'll host like a brown bag lunch for the developers where they all get together and they'll watch the material on a screen in the conference room, and it gives the developers a chance to sit around and kind of talk about what they've just reviewed. So it gives it's a good way to kind of interact with your peers at the same time. So that's one way that I've seen this done in the past.
All right. Now, requirement 6.5 also addresses investigating injection flaws, buffer overflows, insecure cryptographic storage, insecure communications, and improper error handling. Steve, are there any other coding vulnerabilities that need to be addressed?
Well, yeah, basically, through information, again, that you get from the outside world, from the vendors, from, securitytracker.com, and through your own vulnerability scanning, you want to make sure that, when you're analyzing those scan results or looking at that information, that you are, those types of vulnerabilities can be, related to a coding vulnerability, right? So you want to take into consideration whether or not that's something in your code that needs to be addressed in order to correct a vulnerability that's out there.
Okay, this next slide shows some other coding vulnerabilities that need to be addressed, such as cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. Steve, do you have any comments about these coding vulnerabilities?
Well, those are most directly related to web applications. You find some great information in there on the OWASP.org about how to code, in defense of those weaknesses. And then again, at 6.5.6 there, we're looking, that's kind of what I was just speaking about before, is taking a look at all high-risk vulnerabilities and making sure that those are addressed at the coding level if necessary. Validating your input is always critical on web applications to make sure that you're not vulnerable to these web layer weaknesses.
Okay. And next we have requirement 6.6, which requires companies to address new threats and vulnerabilities on an ongoing basis and ensure their web applications are protected against known attacks. Now, Steve, I know it's recommended here to review public-facing web applications for vulnerabilities, at least annually, but how often would you recommend performing a review?
Well, anytime you make a change to your web application, you're going to want to test it. If not through the use of a third party, you're going to want to have the tools yourself to be able to assess it, internally with the appropriate personnel, to make sure that you have not introduced a vulnerability through the change that you've just implemented.
Okay. Gotcha. Now, next we have requirement 6.7, which requires companies to ensure that security policies and operational procedures for developing and maintaining secure systems and applications are documented, in use, and known to all affected parties. Do you have any comments about this requirement?
Yeah, it goes back to what we talked about earlier on requirement 5. You want to make sure that you keep your security policies and procedures updated accordingly to, at least annually, and then when any time you make changes to your environment, either technically or from a business perspective that could impact these documents, you want to make sure you keep them in sync with whatever you're doing. Again, this can a lot of times can affect operational procedures more so than policies, because that's where you're going to document how do you do this, right? So if you're changing a technology, you're putting something else in place, you're going to make sure that you're addressing that at the documentation level, and again, to make sure that those things stay in sync with what's actually taking place in your environment. And again, maintaining that revision history is critical to make sure that your assessor is able to clearly see the history of that document and how it's evolved over time.
All right.
And you know, one other note I would add to this, Brian, is whenever you're making these changes to policies, you want to make sure you socialize this information to the relevant subject matter experts or the personnel who it most directly affects, right? So in this particular case, you know, you may be, you know, your audience may be primarily your developers. You want to make sure that that information gets communicated to those people, you know, through, again, through a quick meeting, go over the document. A lot of times companies will, you know, ask personnel to acknowledge receipt and review of that document through a signature page that's then kept on file. So it's an important artifact to maintain as well.
Okay, good information. We have a few minutes left, and I want to address a question that came in while you were talking. And so let me ask you this, Steve. At what point in the process of preparing for PCI certification should a company engage a QSA?
Yeah, that's a good question. As soon as you know that you need to go through the process, you should contact, you know, start looking for a QSA, and then get an agreement in place, and then possibly consider doing what we call a gap assessment, so that you can get familiar with the data security standard. Your QSA can get familiar with your company, and he can help you understand any gaps that you may have from a policy, procedure, or a technological perspective. So, you know, the farther out ahead of that curve you can get, the better prepared you'll be to undergo the actual security assessment. I will say that, you know, it still happens, you know, all the time. Is, you know, a customer will or a company will have a prospective customer that says, oh, you know, Mr. Service Provider, we need you to be PCI compliant before we can do business with you. And, you know, the customer or the service provider may have no idea what's entailed in the data security standard, but they, you know, now they know that they need to do this in order to get this big customer. So that they, you know, then they start, you know, looking for, a QSA. They finally find a QSA, and then they, you know, immediately want to do an audit, but still are not fully versed on exactly all the technical requirements. You know, there's 212 individual requirements within the data security standard, which is quite a lengthy list. So, you know, we highly encourage customers to go through a gap assessment process where they can learn in detail what the requirements are and find out exactly what gaps they may have, because sometimes there's a lot of documentation that needs to be created, and there's also there can also be some money that needs to be spent in order to put the necessary technical controls in place, you know, security mechanisms that need to be put in place, like intrusion prevention and, you know, antivirus and centralized log management. All those things are take time to implement, and also can take quite a bit of money as well. So definitely want to get out as far ahead of that as you can on your timeline.
Right, good advice. Okay, well, we appreciate the questions today, and I just want to remind everybody that the next webinar in the series will address Objective 4, which concerns implementing strong access control measures and includes PCI requirements 7, 8, and 9. And I'd also like to thank Steve for answering our questions today and providing some valuable insight on PCI compliance. And finally, I'd like to say thanks again for everybody attending today's webinar, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you, Brian.